When people think of the Louvre, they often think immediately of the Mona Lisa, its world-renowned masterpieces, and the millions of visitors who pass through its halls each year. Yet, few realize that the Louvre did not begin as a museum. It was once a military fortress. Before the paintings, there were shields and swords. Before the grand exhibition halls, there were cold stone corridors, dark and guarded by soldiers. And what is truly remarkable is, traces of that past still remain, hidden beneath the glass pyramid in the heart of Paris today. So how did a fortress built for war become the most famous museum in the world? And what has allowed it to endure through more than 8 centuries of history and upheaval? To understand that, we must return to the moment the Louvre first appeared on the map of Paris. At the end of the 12th century, Paris still faced many threats from outside. The risk of war was always present. Before setting out on the Crusades, King Philip Augustus had to face an important question. What would protect the capital in his absence? His answer was not an army, but a fortress, a fortified structure built on the western side of Paris, an area that at the time was still wilderness, covered with forests and marshland. From the very beginning, the Louvre was not born to impress or to display beauty. It was built for a much simpler purpose: to protect the city and survive in times of war. Thousands of workers were mobilized for this project. Stone was transported from quarries located dozens of kilometers away. Then each block was pulled to the site to build a fortress of rare scale for that time. It was here that the first stones of what would later become a symbol of France were laid. At the center stood a massive circular tower, about 30 meters high. Walls up to 4 meters thick made it one of the most formidable defensive positions of its time. When completed, the fortress not only protected Paris but also controlled one of the most important approaches into the city. A deep moat surrounded it, and the only entrance was through drawbridges that were always strictly guarded by soldiers. The Louvre was not only used for military garrisoning, it also stored the royal treasury, important documents, and even the king's secret records. For people of that time, it was both a fortress and a place that held the most valuable assets of the kingdom. Its location was also carefully chosen. Situated along the Seine River, the fortress controlled one of the most important access routes into Paris. From the watchtowers above, any movement coming from the river could be observed. But then Paris began to change. The city gradually expanded over many generations, and the structure that once stood on the edge of the capital's defenses slowly moved closer to its center. Walls once built for war now stood in a more peaceful city. This change also led to a shift in the Louvre's role. It was no longer just a fortress, and from here, its transformation into a royal residence began. For a long time, the Louvre remained a military fortress. Guards were stationed day and night, and some areas inside were even used to imprison captives. It was still a structure built for protection and control, rather than for residence or welcoming others. But then, Paris changed. The city continued to grow, and diplomatic relations became increasingly important. For the kings of France, a dark and heavily militarized fortress no longer suited their needs. The first changes began to appear. Thick walls were opened up, with new windows to let in light. Narrow defensive slits gradually gave up to larger openings. Inside, spaces were expanded into wide halls with high ceilings, creating a completely different atmosphere from a traditional fortress. During this period, a large library was also established inside the Louvre. Nearly 1,000 rare manuscripts were preserved there, turning the site into one of the kingdom's important centers of knowledge. For the first time, the Louvre was no longer only associated with military power, but also with culture and learning. Despite these changes, the Louvre remained in a transitional state. It was no longer a pure fortress as before, but it had not yet fully become a palace. In the middle of the courtyard, the old central tower still stood, reminding everyone of the era when the structure was built for war. But for the new kings, that tower was no longer a symbol of strength. It represented an age they wanted to move beyond. They wanted a completely new image of power. In 1528, King Francis I ordered the demolition of the main defensive tower of the Louvre. This was not just the removal of a structure that had stood for centuries, but also a declaration that the old rule of the Louvre had come to an end. Francis I wanted to transform the site into a royal residence worthy of France's new status. Over many months, the old architectural elements were gradually dismantled to make way for a completely different vision of the building. Narrow, arrow slits disappeared. In their place came large stone windows, opening the space to light and air. Inside, halls were expanded, ceilings were raised, and sculptures along with decorative details began to appear more and more. The Louvre gradually moved away from the image of a military fortress. It became a royal residence, and at the same time a place that expressed the wealth, power, and taste of its rulers. During this same period, art also began to find its place within the walls of the Louvre. Francis I was a strong patron of painting and actively collected works from leading European artists. One of the most famous works that later became part of this collection was the Mona Lisa. At that time, no one could have imagined that a structure once built to defend against invaders would one day become the home of the world's most famous works of art. For many years, the Louvre served as both the royal residence and the center of power in France. But over time, a problem began to emerge. It was no longer large enough. Not only did the interior space become cramped, but moving between royal residences also became increasingly inconvenient. For the king, every journey through the crowded streets of Paris came with risks that were difficult to control. So a bold idea appeared. Instead of changing the streets, they decided to create a private route. A nearly 500-meter-long corridor was built along the River Seine, connecting the Louvre to the Tuileries Palace, roughly the length of 5 football fields placed end to end. The purpose was clear. The king could move between the two palaces without ever stepping into the streets of Paris. Under Henry IV, this idea was expanded into a major project known as the Grand Design. A covered passageway gradually took shape, linking centers of power into a unified system. This structure was more than just a corridor. Hundreds of workers labored for years to complete it, at an enormous cost for the time. When finished, it created the impression of 2 parallel Parises, one below, where everyday life unfolded for the people, and another above it, reserved for royalty and the machinery of power, operating behind walls separated from the rest of the city. But things did not unfold as expected. As the system came into use, certain areas around the Louvre were gradually abandoned, control weakened, and the empty spaces once tied to power began to be filled by ordinary people seeking shelter. The biggest turning point came from a political decision when the royal court moved to Versailles the Louvre was left without a real purpose. No king, no court. The structure that once stood at the center of French power was abandoned.
Yes, my lord. Everything is in...
Over time, the site fell into clear decline. Temporary market stalls appeared in the courtyard. People sold everything, from food and second-hand clothes to livestock. Smoke from cooking fires stained the stone walls that once displayed royal authority. At night, many corridors became dark and empty. The situation went so far that some even proposed an unthinkable solution: to demolish the entire Louvre. To them, it was too large, too costly, and no longer useful. But just when the Louvre stood closest to disappearance, another group saw it differently. Scholars, artists, and lovers of knowledge began to return. They did not see it as a ruined palace or abandoned fortress, but as a place that could preserve the memory of an entire era. The first small exhibitions appeared in forgotten spaces, and from these modest beginnings, a new idea slowly formed. The Louvre could become a place where people come to see, to learn, and to access knowledge once reserved only for the ruling class. As France entered major political and social change, this idea became clearer. What once belonged to the king was gradually opened to the public, and from here, the journey of transforming the Louvre from a closed fortress into a museum for everyone truly began. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out, completely transforming the country's social and political order, and the Louvre also entered a period of change shaped by this wave of upheaval. What had been tied to the monarchy was now seen in a different light, no longer the property of a single dynasty, but something to be preserved for everyone. However, turning the Louvre into a museum was not a simple task. After years of being used for many different purposes, the interior was still in a state of disorder. The process of clearing, reorganizing, and stabilizing the space took years. During this time, many important artworks and objects were brought here for protection against external turmoil. In 1793, the Louvre officially opened to the public, yet its collection at that time was still modest compared to what we know today. Things only truly changed in the early 19th century when exploration, research, and large-scale collecting began to expand rapidly. Artifacts from across the world were brought to Paris, especially from Egypt and the Mediterranean region. Massive statues, ancient inscriptions, and traces of civilizations that had existed for thousands of years began to appear in the galleries. As a result, the Louvre's collection grew rapidly. From just a few thousand objects, it developed into a vast archive of hundreds of thousands of artifacts from many different civilizations. The Louvre was no longer just a museum of France, but increasingly a museum of human history itself. But the more it collected, the more complex preservation became. Stone statues, paintings, papyrus, and ancient objects all required different conditions of care. By the late 19th century, as Europe entered the industrial age, the Louvre began adapting once again. Early modern systems of lighting, heating, and preservation were introduced, marking a new stage in the effort to protect objects that had already survived for centuries. Then came a different kind of challenge. Not decline, but success. Visitor numbers kept increasing, and the old entrances could no longer handle the pressure. In 1981, the Grand Louvre project was announced. At its center was a controversial idea, a glass pyramid rising in the middle of the historic palace courtyard. Many feared that this modern structure would disrupt the historic character of the Louvre, but the answer appeared during construction itself. While digging deep underground to build the new entrance hall, workers unexpectedly uncovered the foundations of a fortress built by Philip Augustus in the late 12th century. A layer of history thought to have vanished had in fact been lying there for centuries. Remarkably, the very modern project that sparked so much controversy ended up revealing the oldest layer of the Louvre's past. Instead of covering these remains, the museum chose to preserve them and make them part of the visitor experience. Today, visitors can descend to the lowest levels of the Louvre and see the remains of the original fortress. Above them stands the glass pyramid of the 20th century. Beneath their feet lie stone walls built in the late 12th century. Few places in the world hold nearly 800 years of history within the same space, and perhaps that is why the Louvre still exists today. It has never stopped changing, yet it has never truly broken away from its past. Today, the Louvre is the most visited museum in the world. But its most remarkable feature may not be the masterpieces displayed on its walls, but the building itself. For more than 8 centuries, it has witnessed wars, the rise and fall of dynasties, revolutions, and transformations that reshaped France into an entirely different nation. Yet every time history changed direction, the Louvre found a new role to continue its existence. And perhaps that is what makes it truly unique. People come here to see the Mona Lisa, but beneath that world-famous masterpiece still lie the remains of a fortress built for war. The Louvre does not simply preserve history, it is history. And its story is only one of the many secrets the past still holds. If you want to continue uncovering stories like this, don't forget to follow and join the journey ahead.